Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local.
So the title of the book is High Impact Content Marketing. And so what is that? You know, we've got a lot of content. There's a lot of content marketing. Everybody's talking about content. Everything is content. But how do you know what defines high impact content marketing?
So high impact essentially is content that actually drives the tangible behavior changes or the desired outcomes that you're looking for, right? We have talked about, or, we've heard about so many times businesses being like, oh, we just need more content, more content. It's like, why? Why more? Like, what's the whole point? What are you trying to do with the content, right? Content marketers' goal isn't just to entertain or educate, right? That's just a whole other misperception in the industry. It's like at the end of the day, we should not forget what we're there for. We're there to sell, and selling can be selling people on a impression that they have of you or building goodwill. It doesn't always have to be monetary, though. That is, any business, nonprofit or not, needs money to survive. And so at the end of the day, don't forget why you're there. You're there to sell, and so everything you do should be tied to that kind of outcome that you're trying to drive. And everyone is very focused on output. And I'm like, no, let's think about outcomes first, and then the output will take care of itself.
Well, so let me challenge that a little bit in terms of brand awareness, right? So there's always this sort of tension in marketing groups between how much energy and time and resources are we going to devote to brand building, brand marketing, brand awareness, and performance marketing. And so I think that this is one of the perennial challenges that people face, because while you can use a piece of content, so you could put a piece of content that could be used for branding behind a paywall and use it for lead gen or whatever, not a paywall, but a form, and use it for lead gen. But often those things are distinct. So let me just challenge you that the purpose is to sell. I mean, would you define sell to include brand building or brand awareness? Is that included in your definition of sell? What do you think about that side of things?
It would be, because ultimately, why do you want to build a brand? So that you can then sell more. So at the end of the day, there's a behavior change that you're trying to get. You're trying to get people to think about you, to build certain memory structures in their mind when it comes to your brand. So it's still an action that you can take on the way. Like, the sale doesn't always have to be the direct. There's those leading indicator steps that can happen along the way too. So that is an action. So whether you're building a brand, whether you're just going straight off to get a bottom funnel offer, but also I don't think we define that correctly all the time, because the funnel is great in terms of a marketing framework to ideate, but no people actually go through the exact steps of the funnel.
It's a fiction. It's a convenient fiction for us to think about structuring our campaigns, but it doesn't really exist as in terms of user behavior.
No, but it's good to have as a reference. I always try to think about is the Eugene Schwartz has the amazing framework with the 5 levels of awareness. Is what do people need to know about you? At any point, if they don't know they have a problem, then you could be banging on about how you've got the best solution, but they don't even know they have a problem. They're not interested. So you've got to make them aware that there is even a problem and that their life can be improved. So in that sense, that's more like brand content. And I always say, I said, what makes a good brand is not philosophical. Like, often the brand is a name because it sells a lot, right? Nike is a household name because a lot of households buy it.
Well, I mean, we could have a hour-long discussion about the importance of brand, or the role of brand in ultimate performance. And a lot of people are very focused on the bottom of the funnel in performance marketing, but I think brand has become more and more important as trust has eroded online. But I want to ask you about differentiating content. So one of the things, so I used to write for Search Engine Land for many years, and I was always on the receiving end of 50, 70, 100 pitches a day, PR pitches, because I was on all these lists. And so these missives would go out, read our report. We've got this new thing. We just did this study, whatever. Very, very often the content that I would see, and I would always ask for it. The content that I received was very bland, kind of generic, sounded very much the same as everybody else. And you talk about this quite a bit in the book. what is the key to differentiating, as there's more and more pressure from an SEO standpoint for people, and lead gen standpoint for people to pump out lots of content, and they're falling back on kind of generic thinking and generic approaches. How do you differentiate your content in a world where content is just overflowing and seeming to, the volume is increasing and the noise is increasing at every minute, especially in a B2B context?
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, it's like we can just remember that there's still only 24 hours in the day. We still eat, we still sleep, we still, go to work, we have chores to take care of. And there's only this much time to consume content. And we've seen such a huge rise, like particularly with AI. And I know we're going to talk about that more. But one of the things it has done is reduce the barrier to entry. More and more people all across the world from all backgrounds are creating content. So there has never been more content. But suddenly we don't suddenly have an extra 24 hours in the same day to consume it all, even though we are consuming more. So we've just gotten really better at filtering and being selective, right? Ignoring content takes no effort. That's what I keep trying to drill into people. It's like ignoring it takes no effort. We're not even competing for that honor of being scrolled past, because our audience is doing that all by themselves. If you want to have people stick on you, it's got to be different. It's got to stand out. It's got to be something that they will want or need to hear. It's something that they would find as a good enough of a value exchange of their time and energy to consume your content. So remember, like it always comes at a price. Even if it's free content that you're throwing up a social media blog and you're like, oh, it was a one tweet. Like, how long does it take to effort to consume that? It's to say yes to you. They had to say no to something else. So are you making it worth their while? And in that sense, regardless of whether it's a bottom funnel, upper funnel, you're building perceptions of your brand. If it's some crappy, boring, like hateful tweet or post, they're not going to want you. If it's super generic, imagine reading a post that starts with "content is king." You're like, oh, puke. Like we've heard that 1,000 times. Like that's not going to make me want to read the next sentence.
Well, so in the book you talk about, implied in your comments is the idea of writing things that are of value, of perceived value to the reader, to the user, whomever that is. And there are different audiences in the world. There's journalists, there's customers, there's influencers, there's many different many different audiences. But you talk about in the book finding the overlap between internal needs and customer needs as a sort of a way to formulate a content strategy, or at the center of a content strategy. So explain that a little bit. Internal needs, what are those audience needs, and what is that overlap? Where do you find that?
So the number one piece of advice that people always get is go study your customers. And that's not wrong advice. That's actually very good advice, but it is incomplete. What are you studying about them? It should be the area that is moving the needle for you as a business. So just like charity begins at home, your research begins internally first too. Try to work with your sales teams, try to work with any stakeholders or leaders to see like what are the overall business goals, where can you as a marketer influence, and what would drive the most impact for the company. So you could have 3 offerings. You could have offering A, B, and C. C might be the one that's most classically popular, but if it doesn't really make you that much money then why are you going after that full steam and putting all your resources towards that? Try to figure out, maybe it's A, and maybe you don't hear so much about offering A, but offering A is the one that if you could even sell 10 units of it in an entire year, you would have hit all your sales goal. They're like, that's what I should focus on. And so then when you go and do your audience research, you're focusing it on the correct areas, on the areas that you can influence revenue impact for yourself as a business.
But so many pieces of content that I've seen will have, somebody does a consumer survey, or they cite research, and they say consumers do XYZ, your customers are going to do XYZ, and then they have some elaborate discussion of that, and then at the end the answer is always our solution, right? It's sort of this setup. problem discussion, and then the answer is always the sale. If you buy our solution, you will solve the problem that your customers, your customers want to check out more quickly online, or they want less friction from a payment processing system, or they want simple returns, or whatever the problem is. And the vendor is always recommending themselves, or very often recommending themselves as the answer to that problem that the research seems to support. I find that very, very unpersuasive. I mean, maybe I'm jaded, but that's a problematic approach to content, because once the sales message comes through, the game over for me. So how would you? That seems to be an example of what you're describing. There's a problem we're going to solve for you, and here's our solution. Now, how would you respond to that critique?
So that's absolutely right. Like, well, if it feels super salesy, people will get put off. No one wants to feel manipulated. Or most people don't generally not want to. But that's not really what my meaning was. It was, even if I want to build brand awareness, even if I want to do something, let's say there's a big thing now where executive thought leadership, that's such a big one. And then companies will say, who in my business should I go out and, build an audience around? Is it just my CEO or C-suite? Like, no, find subject matter experts. So maybe you have somebody who's really interested in sustainability, and they can go out and talk about sustainability or whatever they are passionate about. That's still going to have that halo effect of the goodwill on the overall brand. It will showcase that the brand's thinking about it in that good way. But then what are those right angles? Like, is that important to you to talk about sustainability? Like, if let's say you're a company that actually has a very poor track record of it, do you want to have somebody going out there and talking about sustainability just because it's important to your audience? Then people are going to accuse that company of greenwashing, for example. Or then, you could actually invite trouble on yourself. So first, think about who are you as a brand? What are your core values? What is important for you to get out as a message? And then go and understand your audience's perception or issues or trouble with it. So that's when you find the overlap area of what people want first, but it's prioritized by your business needs. There's never enough hours in the day for what we want to accomplish as marketers. Like, we could be writing ad nauseum and then still not run out of potential possibilities. So to try to select the right path, like if I wanted to do only 3 pieces of content in a single half in 6 months, how would I pick those? How would I prioritize my efforts? It's the stuff that will have the most impact to my organization. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean short-term sales only. It could be, if I'm coming up with a new AI product and then people have concerns about AI, maybe I'll be like, hey, if you're in a nonprofit, here's why you shouldn't sleep on AI advancements. And then maybe give them more educational content, then give them some entertainment. You want to get them thinking.
So you talk about quality over quantity, which is implied in your remarks
every
just a
single
second
time,
ago.
quality over quantity. We do not need.
But what does that mean as a practical matter? What does that mean as a practical matter? It's a kind of a maxim, or even cynically you could say it's a platitude. But what does it really mean for marketing departments? How should they think about it? Because there are a lot of people who are trying to rank. They're trying to put out lots of content for the purpose of ranking and search results, or to have a steady flow of leads because they've got a certain kind of quarterly numbers that they have to hit, and that all argues in favor of quantity. And I worked with a executive who liked to repeat to me, "Done is better than perfect." And while perfect is an impossible standard, I took that to mean just get stuff out the door. That's the most important thing. Ship stuff. So how do you respond to somebody who's demanding, we have to put out 10 pieces of content every quarter, and they have to generate so many leads? That's very much the mindset of a lot of executives. So how do you push back on that with a quality point of view?
One is, first I try to go back to understand their goals, because sometimes they're asking this because they're under pressure themselves, right? They're having to hit certain sales targets. It's hard, especially in situations like the world economy, the way it is right now. There's so much pressure. They're scrambling, but that doesn't mean you scramble. You almost look at what moves the needle for you. What do you always sell? That's where understanding internal priorities comes in. And then you can think about, okay, so who are we trying to get to do what? Where are they? Let's reach them. And then you can make the case. So you don't need to have an arbitrary like 10 posts a quarter. You could create 4 or 5 and then reuse them or repurpose them, put them in different formats, try to achieve. So you want to go back to your strategy. That's why if you don't have a content strategy, you're really setting yourself up to be blown this way and that way and get that question back. So you can go back and make the business case and tie it to business outcomes. So, in fact, this is a concept I took from the world of instructional design, where they call it backward design. So, if you was creating a training program for people to drive behavior change, you don't start with how are we training? You start with what's the sort of desired outcome.
What's the desired outcome? Yep.
Exactly. So the same thing. So let's use an example of electric vehicle. Let's say, Greg, tomorrow you're going to release a new line of fancy, like James Bond-esque electric vehicles. And your goal as a business, if you were a car company, would be to sell many of those cars. So the business outcome is I need to sell cars. But what can we as a marketer, what's the behavior change in the audience that we can influence? We're not sales. We're not going to directly sell, right? So saying that marketing, you didn't sell this many cars is not exactly right. So you could say one behavior change we can influence is getting people to come and take a test drive to do that. And so then I'll go back and think, well, who's the audience that's most likely to come and take a test drive? Who has the money? Who would be interested in this kind of car? What kind of messaging would appeal to them? Where do they hang out? What budget do I need? And only then do you start thinking about the content to create, because everything's very outcome driven. And so you know that if you're going to create this content, it's designed to drive more, pun intended, test drives. And then eventually you'll know your sales' job is to then convert those test drives into sales.
There's just so much to talk about here. I'm trying to be mindful of the time, but let's talk a little bit about. So you should read the book, because the book is just a wealth of information and tons of practical advice and lots of very, very pragmatic tools in the book. But let's talk about distribution channels, and let's talk about content formats, which is another hour-long discussion in and of itself. But there's ever proliferating channels and platforms to use. For example, now that Twitter is sort of deteriorating, there are all these other alternatives, just as one example, Blue Sky and Post and T2 and Threads and so on and so forth. And how do you determine, of course, TikTok over the last 3 years has become a major channel. How do you determine which channels to use as a marketer when you recognizing that you've got limited time and resources and you can't do all of these things equally well? Blogging, video, white papers, etc., etc. Where do you put your emphasis? How do you make that determination?
So the big advice I always give is that you cannot sustainably keep up with all of them. You cannot be everywhere and do it well. I mean, even if you are a fully massive budget owning team, it's still going to be a lot, and it's just not going to be worth it. It's the time and effort isn't there. So in
many ways, this is the question of content marketing. In some respects, this is the central question.
Isn't it? Yes. And so I always think about it in two ways. One is your audience, and two is the actual channel itself and its usage. So one is, what's your audience? Like, where does your audience tend to spend time? And you'll know this. I have a whole chapter on like how do you study your audience, and that will tell you where they spend time. But it's more so, some channels are more for entertainment, some are for education, some are for converting the sale. And so how your audience uses a channel maybe or a platform can be completely different from how it's traditionally used. So I always say this, and many people are like, oh, TikTok is where you go to reach all the young people, Gen Z. And I'm like, there's a lot of other audiences there too. And like, there's an entire like book talk. There's entire, there's a recipe.
Recipes and cook.
There's brand, there's so on, there's older people creating very successfully on there too. It's not just all about this one perception. And so the popular usage of a channel may not be how your audience uses the platform, which is why if you understand your audience, understand where they'll be most receptive to receive the message or what type of message they'll want to receive on different channels. The other popular advice is put the same content on every channel and you're fine. And it's not always the case. That doesn't always work. You want to respect for how the channel is most used by your audience and where they'll be most likely to use it. And so if you have consistent content, if you have consistent messaging, sometimes you can just switch the formats, right? Let's say if you have a post that you put on LinkedIn, you can then take the is as a carousel, you can put image versions of it on Instagram, you could create a short form video of it, a longer video, put it on YouTube, right? You can use your own content more and more. And that's actually, and I know I'm going on a very long answer here.
No, that's fine. We're gonna. I mean, there's so much to cover. This is going to be a longer than normal discussion, which is absolutely fine. People can listen to as much or as little of it as they want, but I want to keep talking. So keep going.
Okay, so I think what I was going to say is that you'll know you're onto a big idea is if you can see multiple different uses of it. And it's really good if you can create it in multiple different formats because different people just absorb content differently as well. So the net to go back to your channels and your format is think about your audience. Where do they like to spend time? Which are the right platforms? Which are the ones that you can get the most engagement from? Email might be really great for some people, and maybe for you, for your audience, it just may not be right? What works for your competitor as well may not work for you. So try to find your own, like test others, have a small presence, but you don't have to be everywhere and don't be active everywhere. You can use the other channels to draw people back. So let's say, for example, Lexi Mills gave me this very funny example in the book where she said, if I was a toe fungus cream, then there's certainly no expectations to have the world's most, popular Instagram or TikTok page. It's just not the right visual medium, but just be there. And then you can guide people to like, come check us out on YouTube, come check us out on like wherever else that you want to guide people to. So think about that. And just because people think LinkedIn's all B2B, it's not all B2B. B2C also is there too. It does well. So think beyond.
How can you? I mean, there's topics that I fear we're not going to get to, such as measurement and formulating a content strategy, and big important topics. But perhaps we'll have a part 2 conversation. But how do you test any of this before committing? So you've got a bunch of people in a room, you've got a bunch of research about your customers and their top needs, you've interviewed your stakeholders internally, so you put all this together in a pot and you've stirred it up and you've come out with a calendar, a content calendar. We want to do these things on a quarterly basis, blah blah blah, and you've made all these kinds of bets. How do you test drive any of it, or how do you determine if it's working before executing, before investing the time and resources and creating all that content? Is that important to do even? I mean, I'm assuming the answer is yes, but give me your point of view.
It is important to do, and how I would measure it is today. So I'm literally telling you what I actually do, which is I do not create content without knowing how I'm going to measure it first. So when I'll create an outline, like what's the outcome that I'm trying to drive? How will I know if I've hit those outcomes? Like what does success look like to me? And then I'll put in like what are some of the key objections that customers get? What are some of the key things that I should mention that will tend to get people excited in the past, all based on stuff that I've learned. I'll even vet things past the sales team as well, because like having that close relationship between sales and marketing is so incredibly important. So I'll vet it with them, and I'll have my measurement outlined before I launch anything. And so then that will be covered there. Then I'll know whether I'm hitting my metrics or not. In some cases, yes, I'll look at it through the sort of levels, like how many people did I reach? What was some of their reactions to it? And then how did they respond to it? And then what were the results that drove at the end? So it really is you go in the line of sight, almost the metrics. So it's like, okay, did I get to reach a lot of people? Who did I reach? Did I reach the right audience? And then what was their sentiment? How did they think about it? Then did they engage? What did they do? Did they share? Did they like? And then did it lead to a sale? Or did we see any behavior change that we were looking for from them? So if you have it mapped out before, then you'll be in a good place. And you can almost make that case as well to the stakeholders that, listen, we're going to launch X, Y, and Z. Here's how we'll measure success. And then we'll report back in this time. And you always want to have a little mix of stuff that is maybe shorter term and then some stuff that's longer term, because you always want to get some irons in the fire. You don't want to ever not do something because the time to results are 6 months and then I'm like, oh, forget it, I'll deprioritize it. Keep it going. So then you're hitting that goal. Like 6 months later, you'll be glad that you did now.
Okay. I have follow-up questions I want to ask, but I also want to move on.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.